the gotcha game. And this is where you have that person that comes to you and starts asking you questions about yourself or maybe some project, something that you're involved in. And it's really pleasant. You're like, wow, this is not, somebody's taking an interest in my thing here or my person. And so you start sharing all this stuff. And then they take that information and immediately turn around and try to find something in it to use against you. Or maybe they go and complain to somebody, so, I got the lowdown, and here's what's really going on with that idiot. So it's a gotcha game. It feels affirming, but in reality, I'm just looking for something that I can use to have a manipulative advantage over you. There's a game that we call Kick Me, which is sort of like the person who puts a kick me sign on their own back, a person who plays the victim and is always talking about their deficiencies and essentially inviting you to participate in this conversation about how deficient they are. And as soon as you do, then they start complaining about how you've hurt them and abused them, and why does this always happen to me? There's the look what you made me do game. Look what you made me do. And look what you made me do is a game in which I am never at fault for anything that I do. So in counseling, we would encounter, for instance, the husband who gets caught cheating on his wife, and somehow it's her fault. Look what you made me do. Or I'm a peaceful protester who just happens to loot and burn a 7-Eleven, but look what society made me do. We play these games all the time. One of the most common games, one of the games that we play constantly with each other, is the yes but game. And in the yes but game, I desperately need help from you. I come to you looking for help, and every suggestion you make, I say, yes, but. So I don't really want your help. What I want is to command your attention during this time and ultimately be validated in my own thinking that there is nothing that can help me in my situation. All of these games, and there are many, many more, all of these games are recognized to be inherently unhealthy. They do damage to us. They do damage to the person who initiates the game. They do damage to the person who gets caught up in playing the game. They're unhealthy. But they're also commonplace. They happen every day. They happen in a large number of our conversations. Huge portion of human dialogue and communication is wrapped up in this energy that we have given to playing these games with each other, to get what we think we need from each other, but not to do it in a healthy, sort of direct kind of way, to do it in this sort of manipulative, backdoor kind of way. I'm going to control this situation. I'm going to feel validated. I'm going to feel important by playing this game and winning it. So a huge portion of human interaction is based, in essence, on lies and manipulation. Isn't that a happy thought? This is why some people will tell you that they prefer the company of animals, right? I have this enormous dog at my house. It's a Mastiff. People always comment on how big he is, and he's quite intimidating when you first meet him, and that deep bark when you come to the door. In reality, he's a big pushover. He's just kind of a sad sack, really. But Winston, that's his name, Winston, when Winston wants something from you, he's not coy about it. You'll get that wet nose right in your face if he wants your attention in that moment. And there's no guessing as to what it is that he wants from you. If he wants to go outside, he'll pace back and forth and whine at you and wait for you to get up and let him outside. Animals are like that. They tend to be very direct. We have this goat. We have a lot of goats, but There's one in particular that really likes chicken feed. Chicken feed is not good for goats. Her attitude about this is, I want it, therefore I should have it. So if I go out to feed the chickens, the other day she jumped over the fence to get into where the chickens were so she could eat their feed. I had to push her away, physically push her away. You're thinking at some point all of this negative reinforcement is going to change her behavior. No, not at all. I want it, therefore I should have it. Here I am, get out of the way. It's frustrating, but at least with animals, it's clear. With people, it's not always so clear. We're not always honest about what we want or how we're going about trying to get it from each other. We're not that direct. Peter says, 1 Peter 2:22, he says about Jesus, he says, He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. Now, Jesus, we're talking about this authentic journey. Jesus is our model of authenticity. He is righteous and he is true. Now, we know that. We understand that as believers. We accept that as one of the core fundamental beliefs. What's remarkable about that sometimes we don't consider is that Jesus is not only righteous and sinless in regard to those sins that we consider big sins, but he's righteous and true in regard to those things that we consider small sins, those sins that we would readily forgive ourselves because they're so commonplace, they're so normal. Now, Peter addresses these small sins to his readers. In 1 Peter 2:1, he says, Therefore, rid yourselves of all malice and deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and slander of every kind. Essentially, Peter says, stop playing games with each other. Stop playing these games. Stop being dishonest. And it's not that the people he's speaking to don't have experience with the big sins. As a matter of fact, in 1 Peter 4:3, he says to them, For you have spent enough time in the past doing what pagans choose to do, living in debauchery, lust, drunkenness, orgies, carousing, and detestable idolatry. In other words, Peter's got a really colorful congregation. I wouldn't necessarily make these assumptions about your past. But Peter is certain that these things are part of the past of his readers. But it's not those big things with which he primarily concerns himself. The underlying condition remains, and the underlying condition is this: the world is broken by sin and deceit. I think a lot of Christians today feel like if they don't have some big dramatic story to tell, that they do not have a Christian testimony. We feel like we have to be a recovered drug addict or something along those lines in order to have a testimony that will be meaningful to people. Because we want one of those big sins, one of those dramatic sins. But that really kind of belies the reality that it's ultimately the small sins that do the most damage. You think about it, the big diseases come on to an individual and they're immediately recognized for what they are. This has been the struggle that we've had with our recent pandemic, right? Is that it's commonplace. The symptoms are all average. This spreads about because it's minor. Big diseases have a tendency to kill themselves off. It's the small illnesses. It's the small illnesses that work their way through an entire culture. Sins that are small, we embrace as ubiquitous. They're everywhere. Everybody has that sin, so why should I feel bad about it? Why should I feel guilty about that sin? Everybody gets caught up in that one. Those small sins are so normal to us that we just sort of adopt them as commonplace, insignificant, unimportant. Which is kind of like bringing dinner guests over to your house and telling them there's only a little bit of poison in tonight's entree. Just a little. Peter says in verse 10, he says, "For whoever would love life and see good days must keep their tongue from evil and their lips from deceitful speech. They must turn from evil and do good. They must seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil." Here's Peter getting right down to the brass tacks of the issue. Do you want to love your life? Do you want to have good days? Well, then you're going to have to deal with the sin and deceit that's in your life. We say, nobody's perfect, and that is true enough. I'm certainly not. But even as we acknowledge our own imperfection, even as we acknowledge our own character flaws and issues, we do have to understand that sin interferes with this relationship between us and God. It messes things up. Now, Peter doesn't say if you have sin in your life, God won't hear you at all. In fact, Scripture says quite the opposite of that. But he does say something, and this is pretty remarkable, does say something that's echoed by the other writers, which is if you are righteous, you have God's special attention. If you are righteous, his eyes are upon you. His ears are more open to you. Your prayers are more readily received, and they carry more weight. Righteousness has that impact on our relationship with God. Ironically, we're often caught up in playing the yes but game with God. God has the answers for us. God has the direction for us. God says, look, you want to love your life? You want to have good days? I have a path for you. We look at the path and we say, well, yes, but I've got some other idea. I've got some other plan. I have some other directions that I may want to try first. And if my plan doesn't work out, then we'll come back to your plan. Here's the reality. Life that is drawn from brokenness is a prison. And it doesn't really matter if the brokenness is big and obvious or if it's small and commonplace. This is the premier denial. This is the denial that everybody in our culture loves to embrace. This belief that a life that is drawn from something that is less than Christ will somehow be satisfying. But a life that is drawn from something less than Jesus Christ is a dry well. It's a dry well. Every time we dip our bucket into it, if we get a small taste of water, we're doing good, because the well is already dry. And yet our capacity to discount Christ, sort of put Christ on the back burner as if his plan is not really all that great, our capacity to discount Christ and to try things that are less than Christ over and over and over and over again to try to find contentment, to try to find satisfaction is remarkable. Our capacity as human beings to play this game without ever recognizing how silly and foolish and stupid it is incredible. I spent my whole life in the church, and I still find myself playing this game with God. We're just playing games with sin and deceit, and Christ is righteousness and truth. When we compare this picture of righteousness to what we think of righteousness in the world, we talk about what it is to be a good person. good person. We know lots of good people. I'm trying to be a good person. We compare that worldly idea of what good people are to who Jesus is. And he embodies righteousness and truth. In essence, we're saying Jesus doesn't play games. He doesn't play games. He doesn't fool around with that stuff. Think about how many conversations we get to eavesdrop in as we read through the Gospels. How many conversations where people come to Jesus clearly with an ulterior motive. Sometimes the text just tells us they were asking this, but really what they were trying to do was this. Sometimes it's the teachers of the law trying to trap him in some clever argument. Sometimes it's a would-be disciple who comes to him and says, let me be your disciple. And really, he recognizes immediately they're not really there. They're not really prepared for that. What are they really after? In every one of those instances, Jesus doesn't get caught up in the game. He simply refuses to play the game. When we read that Jesus amazed the people because he spoke to them with authority, I think part of what that is that Jesus doesn't engage with people in the manipulative ways that they try to engage him. He's always the adult in the room. No matter how you come at him, he comes back with who he is and the wisdom of who he is. He's always that adult. He doesn't get caught up in it. He doesn't use games to try to manipulate us, and he cannot be manipulated himself. He is the self-described well of living water. He never runs dry. He is a fountain. And life that is drawn from the fountain is freedom. This is why Peter can say to us that we live as free while we live as slaves of Christ. It's simple. If you draw your life from something that is less than Christ, you are dipping your bucket in a dry well. And you are condemning yourself to always being thirsty. If you live in Christ, if you are drawing your life from Christ, you are dipping your bucket in a fountain that's constantly overflowing, and you will always be satisfied. But importantly, that satisfaction, that contentment is not the freedom to sin. And this is where we get caught up. This is the big mistake that we make. How can slavery to Jesus be freedom if we don't have the freedom to choose to do whatever we want to do? This freedom is not the freedom to sin, it's freedom from sin. Rabbi Zacharias, who sadly passed away this year, was a great apologist for the church and for Scripture, said that true freedom is not the liberty to do whatever we want, it's the strength to do what we should. Now, some of you this morning might be saying, okay, why don't I feel that? Why doesn't my life feel more touched by God? How come when we look at the church, it just doesn't have that power that we see as we read about the church in Acts? How come it seems so powerless and lifeless at times? Where is this kingdom that we keep talking about? Well, folks, I really do try not to be overly negative and critical, but we've got to deal with the reality here. The church today is limited by its divided loyalties. See, today's Christians and today's churches try to live with a foot in both camps. We want to be in the world and in Christ. Now, Christ says you could be in the world but not of the world. We want to be of the world and still have this claim to Jesus. We want to occupy both spaces. We want to adopt aspects of the Christian faith, but we're still going to value things the way that the world values them. Now, Christ warns us that if we're truly his disciples, the world is going to hate us the way that it hated him. Peter warns us that when we suffer for doing good, we're going to return good for the evil that's done to us. We're going to take whatever suffering is imposed upon us, and we're going to answer that suffering with hope in Jesus Christ. We're going to gently, respectfully, righteously respond, not in kind to the way that the world treats us, but out of kind to the way that the world treats us. But it has not been our assumption in the modern church that we will be hated at all, that we'll even be disliked. If our journey lacks a certain authenticity, I think it's because of these dualities, this attempt to be in both spaces at the same time. The journey, the authentic journey, reflects the destination, which is the kingdom. Does our journey reflect the kingdom? Now, folks, there's an awful lot of people today who go by the name Christian who do not want to even be mildly inconvenienced for the kingdom, much less suffer for it. Peter says Jesus suffered and died to bring the righteous and the unrighteous into new life. We've got to wonder, if Jesus is willing to suffer and die for the unrighteous, what are we prepared to do for them? And then he draws this comparison to Noah and his family escaping the flood in the ark. And he says that they are saved from the water by the water. They are saved from judgment by the judgment. And in 1 Peter 3:21, he says, this water symbolizes baptism that now saves you also. Not the removal of dirt from the body, but the pledge of a clear conscience towards God. It saves you by the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at God's right hand with angels, authorities, and powers in submission to him. Now, one of the things we got to understand here is that baptism, particularly among the Jews, was a really commonplace act. It was something, it was a bath that you took, and you took it every time you touched something that made you unclean. You touched blood, or you touched an animal carcass or a dead body. Anytime you touched something that made you unclean, then you would take this bath, and it would ceremonially make you clean. Well, Peter says, look, this is different, because this is not about something outside of you that you may had contact with. This is not about the washing of your body. This is about a pledge and an appeal from within. We know that the authentic Christian journey, the authentic journey of the disciple, has as its destination the kingdom. But what is it that makes a journeyer authentic? What is it that makes us real in this process? Well, the authentic journeyer, Peter will tell us, sees the world for what it is. Peter even says that Jesus preached in spirit to the lost in those days of Noah, but in spite of his efforts, only 8 people were saved. Only 8 prepared to get on the ark. Only 8 of them see the world for its sin and its deceit. And here's the thing, you just don't get on the ark at all unless you can see the fate of the world. Now, like the 8 who boarded that ark, we don't always completely comprehend the destination. They didn't know where this was taking them. They didn't know where they'd end up. We a lot of times don't know where we'll end up. We don't know where the journey is taking us. And even when we think about the ultimate destination, We understand that the kingdom is going to be perfected. We understand that the heaven and the earth are going to be made new, and all the things that are beautiful around us, all the things that we admire about creation are going to be made perfect again the way that He intended. That's a beautiful idea, but a lot of it still remains beyond our comprehension. It's beyond our perception. And yet, we can see the world as it is right now. We can witness its sin. We can witness its deceit. We can see its foolishness, its injustice, its selfishness, its violence. We can see the world for what it is. That by itself ought to be enough to convince us that there could be something better. 1 Peter 4, starting in verse 1, therefore, since Christ suffered in His body, arm yourselves also with the same attitude, because whoever suffers in the body is done with sin. As a result, they don't live the rest of their earthly lives for evil human desires, but rather for the will of God. And this is critical. The authentic journeyer leaves the old life behind. These 8, they board the ark. They seal the door. They take the journey. I think in some ways they have a certain advantage in that once you have made that step, the old life is just gone. It's washed away. There's no going back. It's not like Lot's wife. We turn back and look at the life we're leaving behind. It's gone. Baptism is intended as a definitive journey, a crossing point. It's about trading a life of sin and deceit and evil desires for the will of God. And how do we know that we're living for the will of God? Well, Peter seems to suggest that if we are truly living for the will of God, we will suffer in body. We will mourn the loss of our own selfishness. If you've ever thought about that before. But it is not easy to let go of selfishness. It is not easy to let go of my obsession with pleasing me. How do I know that I have done it, even just a little bit? Well, if I mourn the loss of it, then I know I've actually let it go. Peter says, if the one who suffers in body, the one who suffers the loss, is ready to do the will of God, if we're willing to suffer that loss, we really are done with sin. And it doesn't mean that we won't sin. We certainly will sin. But we'll no longer live for sin. We'll no longer be enslaved by sin. The authentic journeyer chooses Christ as the source, not a source. And this is where the ark becomes a very powerful symbol, because as the old is washed away, what else is there for you to depend on? They bob around on the ark for months and months, even after the rain stops. They're totally dependent on God to choose their destination. This is what we've been invited into. The choice to depend on God for our final destination and every intermediate destination. He is the source. He is the well. And modern Christianity has probably done us a disservice because of our use of the word received. John, in his gospel, in the very first chapter, talks about those who received Christ and those who didn't. And so we have taken that idea and we talk to each other about asking Jesus into our hearts, where honestly, Jesus is one among a lot of influences in our hearts. We invite him into our hearts so we can compete with them. But, the biblical idea of receiving Jesus is really different from the modern idea of receiving Jesus. The biblical idea of receiving Jesus is this notion. Now, when an outside king defeated the king of your city or your nation, and you'd surrendered, then that new king would be approaching your city, and a delegation would go out to the new king and receive him outside of the city and bring him in and escort him to the throne room as a symbol of the fact that we recognize you now as the king. The very same symbolism, the very same picture that we get in Thessalonians. And it says that we'll go and meet him in the air. The whole theology people have created about this idea of meeting Jesus in the air when he's descending. And say, oh, that means that we're going to meet Jesus in the air and he's going to take us off to heaven. No, we meet him in the air because he's coming here. Because the city, the holy city has descended and here comes the king. And so a delegation goes out to meet the king and receive him and bring him back. This business of receiving Jesus in Scripture is not about inviting him in amongst all of the other influences and powers in our life. It's about acknowledging that he is now the new king. He has authority over me and everything else. I'm going to escort him right into the throne room where he can do his job. If the promise of hope is not being realized in our lives, what we've got to do is we've got to look at who occupies the throne room. If the promise of kingdom is not being realized in our churches, what we've got to do is we've got to look and see who exactly is really, finally, ultimately on the throne around here. Whose will and whose plan are we serving? Because the authentic journeyer builds from a divine blueprint. You think about Noah. Based on this promise from God, this prophecy and this promise, Noah starts a construction project that will last for decades. Scripture doesn't clarify that for us, but we estimate between 55 and 75 years he worked on the ark. He committed to it for decades because of what he understood about the destination. And you think about that, that's a lot of time and a lot of materials. And Noah decided to build his dream house. He could have built quite a palace. It'd be something else. But Noah understands the destination. He understands God's will in the process, and so he doesn't build for himself. He builds for him. Whatever we build has to reflect our kingdom destination. It has to reflect the will of God. Right now in this, in your leadership team right now is dreaming about how we can reach out and heal broken families in this community, broken and suffering people. That is a ministry modeled after Jesus Christ himself, who would go into a new town, and what would he do first? He'd heal the sick. He would gain an audience for his message about the kingdom by bringing healing from the kingdom. This is such a kingdom thing to do. The kingdom response to brokenness in the world is to bring healing. But it's difficult. It's difficult because the kind of healing that we have to offer through the Lord is not the kind of healing that our culture thinks it needs right now. It's not the kind of healing that it's even inclined to accept. As a matter of fact, many of the messages that we would share with people will be rejected outright as not fitting into our new modern context, our new world. Peter says in chapter 4, verse 4, they are surprised that you do not join them in their reckless, wild living, and they heap abuse on you. But they will have to give an account to him who's ready to judge the living and the dead. In other words, The authentic journeyer lives as a missional contrarian. Those are my two big words for the morning. Missional contrarian means that we live for a purpose that defies the world's understanding. Are they going to take issue with us? Oh, you better believe they are. Are they going to find fault with what we teach? You know they are. We stand for something different. We live for something different. We live by a different purpose regardless of whether or not the world comprehends it, regardless of whether or not the world understands it. We will stand for truth. We will stand for righteousness. And not our righteousness, but the righteousness of God. Not our justice, but the justice of heaven. Not love as we have defined it, but love as the life of Christ has defined it. And the world is not going to stop expecting and even demanding that we comply with its version of love and its version of justice and its version of righteousness. But folks, honestly, what does the world have to offer the problems that we are facing right now? Rioters embrace violence and vandalism? Does that seem like a good solution to anybody? Our politicians ramp up their insincere rhetoric and pose for the cameras but do nothing? Does it seem helpful to anybody? Suddenly, anybody with an opinion and a Twitter account is a moral authority in the culture? Does this seem remotely useful? How do the broken ideas of broken people fix a broken world? I'm sorry, I'll take Jesus. Just seems like a better idea to me all the way around. I'll take Jesus. But, and here's the thing. Here's maybe a big part of the reason the world is so reluctant to consider Christ. It is humbling to serve and follow Christ. Because he's perfect. He's perfect. Unlike this broken world, honestly, the world is broken, but in a lot of ways, I fit in better there. I fit in better because I'm broken too. I don't fit in with Jesus because he's perfect. And when I'm with him, it makes me aware of just how broken I am. That's uncomfortable. That's difficult. It is humbling to serve and follow Jesus, and we don't like being humbled. But the authentic journeyer also rejoices in grace. Because while we were still yet sinners, Christ died for us. And though I am yet a sinner, he has not forsaken me. Though my journey is not always authentic and true as it should be, Jesus Christ continues to offer me love and forgiveness. I can find the strength to do what I should. I can find the courage to fulfill my mission because of grace. The authentic journeyer says, I will leave myself and my sin, and I will live for him. And I know at the outset that I am not up to the task. And yet I am made his servant, his missionary, and his heir anyway. He is making me all that I am, and his grace covers all that I am not. Now, I am not in the habit of closing a service with an invitation. Don't invite people to come up and get baptized on Sunday morning. I know that frustrates some of you because you grew up with it. I grew up with it too. I want you to understand this. I've not gotten out of that habit because I consider baptism unimportant. As a matter of fact, it's quite the opposite. My fear is that in these sessions that we used to have, where the preacher would tell you over and over again all the reasons that you needed to get baptized, and then we'd sing 17 verses of Just As I Am, and if you didn't come forward after that, he'd stop, tell you again how bad you were and how much you needed to be baptized, and we'd sing 4 more verses. Wait for that bench up front to be filled. Every youth event I went to when I was in youth ministry, I don't know if they still do this, but every youth event I ever went to when I was in youth ministry, afterwards they'd send me a report on how many kids we baptized, because that was the mark of our success. I started to wonder after a while who we were trying to make feel good about what we were doing. Because we invited a lot of young people into the water without inviting them into Christ. So I don't often offer an invitation. But hopefully I've made this clear enough this morning that you know exactly what I'm inviting you into. Do you need to be baptized this morning? Come and talk to me. Come and talk to Caleb. Talk to one of our elders. We'd be happy to do it. Heater's out on the baptistry, incidentally, right now. You can either grin and bear it, or since it's going to be cold anyway, we'll take you down to the river today. Baptize you right out in God's baptistry, right down the road. We'll do it. Because it's that important. But it's not just important that you participate in the act. It's important that you participate in the appeal. The appeal, what Peter calls the appeal to God from a clean conscience. The appeal to something real. The recognition that even if I don't understand everything about the journey that you want to take me on, what I do recognize is that this world is not the world that you designed for me. It's broken. It is deficient. And I will take your version of things over anything that the world has to offer to me. That's the business of salvation. That's the authentic journey, and that's how we take it. Let's stand.